I don't read books often, but if I'm going to, I think I'm going to pick this one up because this story has filled my news feed for the last couple weeks. Not sure why, other than the fact that it's so interesting. And I'm talking about Lisa Guerrero's memoir titled Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. Now, if you're not familiar with Lisa, she's an award-winning journalist, an actress, a former sportscaster, an artist, a model, cheerleader. I even think you're in the Cheerleading Hall of Fame, are you not?
I am. I'm recently inducted into the Professional Football Cheerleaders Hall of Fame inaugural class. Woo-hoo.
I need to get my daughter down here. She's a high school cheerleader. She'd be like, you'd be her idol.
Your daughter needs to read my book.
Yeah, well,
Jason, get her to read my book.
So there's a lot in this book that, I mean, you've hurdled some hurdles. I mean, you've had to deal with a lot in your life to the point where it was detrimental to your mental health. So let's start, I guess, probably maybe Playboy days before sportscasting, correct?
After sportscasting.
Oh, that's right.
Actually, it was kind of like bookend, actually. So I was signed with Playboy Models when I was in my late teens, early 20s. I was a swimsuit model and fitness model. Playboy Models was an agency that represented not just playmates, but also models that did fitness. So as a requirement with that agency, I was asked to go on Friday nights to the Playboy Mansion. And I was so intimidated. I had never had alcohol. I didn't do any drugs. And, I walked into the Playboy Mansion the first time and I was disgusted. I was like, all these old men hitting on these young women and everybody's drinking and doing drugs. But of course I'm fascinated. So I go down to the grotto, which was really stinky and smelly and crusty and actually kind of gross. But I was fascinated by this world, by this landscape, by these glamorous women. But I wasn't a playmate at the time. As my career started to grow as a sportscaster later on, the Playboy organization kept offering me first to be a playmate and then later to be a cover model for the magazine, which I rejected every year for 20 years. So it wasn't until after I was a sportscaster and trying to rebuild my career after Monday Night Football that I finally said yes to Playboy. And I became their cover model at the age of 41. And that was really an incredible experience, which I write about in my book. And that led to Inside Edition doing a story about me. And then they offered me a 2-year correspondent contract. And here we are 17 years later. I'm now the chief investigative correspondent for Inside Edition, thanks to Playboy. And since then, I've done 600 investigations for the show.
And you do a great job. I'm a fan. Not only you, but in Inside Edition, you do a fantastic job.
Thank you.
Here's why my heart breaks for you, because I knew a good number of women that were in the exact same situation as you, and you're labeled this toy in the world, especially a world of men, and you're not taken seriously. And I've known personally a lot of women that your book is their lives. I've known women that did Playboy and similar things were talked. A friend of mine was the 2006 Playboy Playmate of the Year, Kara. And, but a lot of these women that do the FHMs, which I believe is kind of where it started with you, and the Maxims back in the day, that was kind of the appetizer before Playboy. I know it was with Kara because I helped her win that contest, is that you're not this, not all these girls are these promiscuous party girls. So when they show up, these guys, these celebrities think that you are and expect certain things from you when you're at the Playboy Mansion because of who they are, right?
Yeah. And again, I was there when I was really young and I was very innocent. And I brought empty Tupperware containers with me so that I could swipe the free food. And then I would get into my crappy Toyota Celica and split before the old men came out of the screening for movie night. So I found a way to get over on Playboy in my own way back then. And then, of course, my career exploded. I became an actress and was on, Sunset Beach, and then became a sportscaster. So all these amazing things happened after that beginning part at the Playboy Mansion. And but what I learned was that, yes, women are viewed as commodities. And if you're on television, a big part of your job is to look good because it's a visual medium. So that's a given. You better look good if you're going to be a female sportscaster. But if you look too good, then you're simply a bimbo. And so it's this interesting thing. And again, I started my career in the 90s. There weren't a lot of women that looked like me back then. My very first news director, when I was hired as a sports reporter, asked me to cut my hair short, not wear nail polish, and don't ever wear lip gloss. They wanted to kind of make me look androgynous. And I rejected that. I said, I'm Latina. I look like I look. I have long hair. I'm happy with my femininity. I'm comfortable in my sexuality. And lo and behold, the ratings went up on that show. And then when I left the show and went to another station, the ratings on that station went up. So I think people understand that women can be attractive and sports knowledgeable, fun to watch, intelligent, funny, all of those things. But at the time in the 90s, it was not done. And, there were other female sports reporters before me, certainly, but I think I was the first one that was, had this really glamorous look and was also an actress, a working actor at the same time. I was on an Aaron Spelling show Monday through Friday while I was a sportscaster for CBS on the weekends and Tuesday and Thursday nights. So I was doing both at the same time.
Isn't it funny that in the especially news business, they might not say this out loud, but it is definitely true. The men that they hire, they want them to be fairly good looking, unless you've been there for 30 years and you're grandfathered in. But if you're hired, it's visual. You don't want them to be ugly. But if women are too good looking, they feel the audience is not going to take them seriously. Isn't that just so weird that mindset's there? It's still there.
It is. And it's so weird to me. And I guess maybe because I live in Los Angeles and, that there's like a hyper awareness of what you look like and, fashion and trends and beauty. And, I laugh a lot because I am Latina. And if you watch Univision or Telemundo, the women broadcasters are like very sexy, very hot, very, even, my age at 58, you see women my age on those other networks, that are Latina that have it going on, and they can have some cleavage and they can have, wear red nail polish and they're still reporting the news and they're still badass, interviewers. So people don't really blink an eye that much about that in that community, but in white America, they have a little bit more, they have a bigger problem trying to get their head around, wow, you can be sexy and smart and funny and articulate and sports knowledgeable and be able to chase bad guys down. That's just like mind blowing.
Well, I've got friends that will watch Telemundo because they can't afford Playboy, just because the girls are so beautiful.
Girls are hot. Those women have it going on. God bless them.
So you've always been a fan of sports. I believe I read it was just ingrained from your parents. Growing up, you just loved sports. So that was the direction you went, and you then get the gig of all gigs for Monday Night Football as a sideline reporter. And that really probably was one of the biggest arrows in your ego and in your heart, right? The way that you were treated by people of name that have credentials.
Right. I was not prepared for the amount of criticism I would face. At that time when I was hired by Monday Night Football, which was 2003, I had already been a local, regional, and national sportscaster in Los Angeles. So I started at CBS 2, then went to Fox 11, then went to Fox Sports Net and was on Sports Geniuses, Tough Man, The Best Damn Sports Show, period, Southern California Sports Report, national sports report as an anchor and a correspondent, doing sit-down interviews with Barry Bonds, Alex Rodriguez, Kobe, Shaq, massive superstars. And I had made a really great name for myself as a tough reporter and an anchor, a sports anchor. So when I was hired by Monday Night Football, I think there was a resentment towards me in mainstream media and in the sports media that I didn't come from ESPN or New York-based media, East Coast media. They saw me as this LA bimbo, as a former cheerleader, as a model, or simply an actress. And they ignored the decade that I had worked as a sportscaster. So I faced criticism before I ever even picked up a Monday Night Football microphone. But I did the egregious thing, which was I misspoke after my very first regular season game while interviewing Patrick Ramsey after the game. I called Lafernius Coles his former teammate instead of teammate because we were talking about the Jetskins. The Jets turned Redskins. So, former teammates facing off, that Monday night on the first regular season game was the theme heading into the game. So I misspoke. I quickly corrected it on the air, but that was it. That was all the critics needed to say. See, she doesn't know football. She doesn't know who she's talking to. She's a bimbo. So that became the beginning of the slut shaming for the rest of that season and then the following year as well. Even long after I was fired from Monday Night Football, I was still criticized and bullied and, really, I thought, unfairly abused in the media. And so that led to depression and anxiety. And, at one point I was so sick that I really had suicidal ideations. I wanted to kill myself over this job, which sounds outrageous to me now. At the time, if I could go back and tell my younger self 20 years later, things get better, ignore this. You're going to build a better career, a bigger career. But at the time, sports was my identity. That's all I knew. And I had worked so hard to build myself up to the career path to get the biggest job in sports, which was sideline reporter for Monday Night Football at the time. And when I was fired from that, I didn't for a long time, I didn't have the will to live. And I almost killed myself, literally almost drove my car off PCH.
Wow.
And were you fired just from misspeaking that one time?
So the culmination, I think, of the entire season was kind of like it was a slow motion avalanche. So once that happened, the narrative was she doesn't know sports. She doesn't know football. She's a model. And it didn't matter what I did. For example, at one point I wore a bright red nail polish, and a columnist actually wrote an entire column about how my polish was distracting and that, only whores wear red or something like that. Things that they would never allow, like an editor would never allow that to be printed today in a newspaper. Sports radio was having a field day with me. And so because of the criticism and because I had a verbally abusive boss that I was scared of, I really was not performing as myself. I wasn't able to write my own copy. After 10 years of being a sports reporter, I had always written my own copy. All of a sudden, my executive producer is rewriting every single word of my copy, expecting me to say it verbatim. And if I didn't, he would scream at me in my earpiece in front of 40 million people. So of course I wasn't, I think the most confident self that I could have been. And, as I got through that season, I improved until, the very last game was the Brett Favre Green Bay Oakland Raiders game, which is kind of an infamous, incredible game. And I looked back at that and I saw all of my hits unedited back to back. And I was like, oh, holy crap, I'm really good. I was very good at that job at the end of the season, despite all that criticism. But I didn't see that at the time. At the time, I was so depressed and overcome by anxiety and fear that I was not performing, the way that I could have and should have been.
I wish one of your friends would have pulled you aside and said, Lisa, it's the Redskins. It's okay. You can, and this is coming from a guy that grew up a Redskins fan, and on top of that, it's Patrick Ramsey and Lavernius Coles. No offense, fellas.
You mean the Commanders?
Yeah.
You mean the Commanders?
The Commanders.
I don't think we're using that term anymore.
I apologize, but you were the first. I mean, you were fairly no holds barred. You weren't afraid of these athletes when you sat down with them. You were the first one to kind of go at Barry Bonds, right, about the steroid abuse.
Yeah, I was the first person to ask him on camera if he had taken steroids. I sat down. It took me 8 months to get this interview. I had to go through Scott Boras, Rachel Viscara, his managers, his agents, all his team to get that interview. And finally, I got the interview. They gave me 20 minutes. We jumped in. I kind of disarmed him with a booger check. And he roared with laughter, and that kind of warmed him up. And that interview lasted about an hour and a half and ran on several nights on Fox Sports Net over that next week, and really helped to solidify my reputation as a tough reporter, but also a reporter that was able to get emotional answers out of very tough athletes.
What did he say when you asked him about the steroids?
So, of course, he denied it. He did make some news. He admitted taking creatine and some other supplements. One of the fascinating things in that interview, though, my takeaway was, his dad, Bobby Bonds, endured a lot of criticism in the media, and his dad was an alcoholic. And Barry talked openly about being a child of an alcoholic and about seeing this negativity written about his dad constantly in the local papers that he was reading. And so that was the basis of his animosity with the media. His now famous animosity came from being a kid and reading about his dad in such negative terms. So that really made me see him as a human being, and again created this line of empathy that I use today when I talk to my victims on my investigations. The trauma that I endured has helped me be a more empathetic and compassionate reporter. And I think that in general, our country can use a lot more empathy and less judgment, less cruelty, and more of an acknowledgement that there's somebody on the receiving end of any kind of cruelty or negativity or criticism or toxic behavior online. Somebody is there, they're absorbing that. So I think empathy is what I write about a lot in my book, Warrior.
And it was so bad it made you have a miscarriage.
Yeah, I think, when I was on Monday Night Football and I was enduring a lot of this criticism, I found out I was pregnant. I was early in my pregnancy, somewhere between 8 and 12 weeks. And towards the end of the season, I had a game where, as usual, I was throwing up before and after my interactions with my boss. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep at all during that season. I was really physically and emotionally sick. And in the first quarter, I started to feel a cramp. By the second quarter, I felt really dizzy, very nauseous, and a lot of pain. And by halftime, when I went into the officials' bathroom, which was right behind me in the tunnel, I realized that I was having a miscarriage. But instead of telling my producer, instead of calling 911, instead of going immediately to the emergency room, I realized that if I did that, I'd be fired. I thought I would endure more criticism for not being tough enough to get back out onto the field for the second half. So I shoved a bunch of paper towels into my pants. I buttoned up my long coat so nobody could see the blood. And I went out in that second half and continued the game, which was, now I know, insane and risky, physically risky. But I was so sick at the time that I was more afraid of the criticism had I left than of my physical health.
You should send your copy of your book to Brock Purdy and say, you know what I did to go to work and you couldn't to get through a championship game.
That poor kid, and this is the thing, like there is a culture of cruelty in sports. There is a demand for, human performance. There is this almost ridiculous expectation that we have to be these tough superheroes, that we have to take aggression and that we have to take toxic behavior and toxic language. I spoke to Bob Costas in the writing of my book to get his advice on a couple of things. And he said to me, that's just the culture of sports. I had a producer that yelled at me all the time. They all do. I'm here to say that that's not appropriate. I don't care if you're a sportscaster. I don't care if you're an accountant. Nobody deserves to be yelled at. Nobody deserves to have verbal abuse lobbed at them in their job. I don't care who you are. So I think we need to check ourselves when it comes to the culture of cruelty in sports.
I've yelled at Nate before. He's been my producer for a long time. And right now, that's all I can think about is the day that I yelled at him. I know it is.
Don't do it. Be nice. Send him flowers.
That was a long time ago.
People evolve, Jason. People evolve. You know, you can ask forgiveness and be a better person moving forward.
No. Going back to the Playboy stuff, Hugh Hefner. I've heard different stories about Hugh Hefner, again, from people that I know that have been out there and been a part of that world. I've heard the good and I've heard the bad and I've heard the creepy. Where would you put him in those categories?
Well, in my circumstance, he was very nice to me. I was a cover, a celebrity cover at 41. So I certainly wasn't being treated like a young girl that was living at the mansion, because I had already had a career. So he was nice to me. But years later, I became the host of a show called Secrets of Playboy on A&E, which was a massive hit last season. And we're getting ready to shoot season 2 right now. But through that show, I was able to interview lots of women who had a very different experience, who claimed that, he was abusive to them, that he sexually assaulted some of them, that he gave them drugs, and, that he and other people in the Playboy world, really misused and mistreated, and in some cases sexually assaulted these women. I believe them. They told me their stories, and that's now on the record, and part of how history is going to maybe redefine who Hugh Hefner really was.
Do you work with Samantha Bennington?
No.
With that show? Yeah, 'cause we've had her on a couple times. She's Chester Bennington from Lincoln Park's widow. She was doing something with that show, and we've had her on a couple different times. She's a fantastic human being. She was doing like PR for the show or something. I thought she brought up your name at one time and asked if, because we had been talking about the Playboy show, because it's actually a very, very good show. It's very, very interesting.
It won a Critics' Choice Award last year. Yeah, we were best documentary series in the crime and justice space. So yeah, I'm really proud of that show. It's an incredible program. You can watch it on Hulu, you guys, if you want to catch up on it before the second season.
Did you ever run across an athlete during an interview not interested in your questions, but more interested in you and your body, and try to hit on you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was kind of part of, and especially when I was young and beautiful, and
you're still beautiful, Lisa,
out there in the world. Thank you, shucks. But yeah, that was part of the deal. Athletes would hit on me. I remember within a 48-hour window, I was hit on by an executive from my network, a player in a locker room, an owner. I'll tell you who he was. His name was Donald Sterling. He used to own the Clippers. Yeah. And another member of the media, like one of my colleagues at a different network, in a 48-hour window. So that's something that women in sports, just deal with, and we shouldn't have to. But especially back then in the 90s, it was like we were fair game, and we were, people were pretty aggressive. And, I talk in the book about, being actually grabbed, physically, sexually assaulted in a locker room by another member of the media in a media scrum. So, it's something that I have had to endure. I shouldn't have had to. Well, and I hope women don't endure those things today.
Were any of those advances to you from an executive or a player, did you ever chalk any of those up as you were flattered? Because, I mean, you married a professional athlete, and I don't know how you met, but maybe it was during an interview and you just found him attractive.
So, no. Let's be very clear. Read my book. No, I didn't. I never interviewed Scott Erickson. I had never met him. So he was at the time a baseball player for the Baltimore Orioles. Mm-hmm. And I was on a show called The Best Damn Sports Show, period. And I had just interviewed Barry Bonds, and his publicist, Rachel Viscara, also represented Scott Erickson. So she wanted us to meet, and I said, no, I'm not interested in dating a baseball player. And she gave him my cell phone number anyway. And the first time he called, I hung up on him. Second time he called, I talked to him for about 3 minutes and then hung up on him. And he was relentless. And eventually we made a bet over the World Series, and I won. And so he flew to my town and we went out, and then we became engaged pretty soon thereafter. But yeah, no, I had never covered him. So I didn't date the players that I covered, and I didn't date the people I worked with. I kept that very separate.
But that, it's such a, I don't know if catch-22 is the right term or not. And by the way, I'm not condoning when women are treated like that. I'm just saying people meet in the environment that they're in mostly. And if you're working all the time and you're a human being and they're a human being and just things happen, the guys never put restrictions on that. Well, now maybe they do, definitely not then. But women have always been forced to put those restrictions, even if there's a spark or they want to get to know someone. You almost have to force yourself not to like the person.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the environment, right? It depends, in my case as a sports reporter, I thought it would be a bad idea for me to date any of the players that I covered for a couple of reasons. Just ethically, how do you report fairly on your boyfriend if he's had a lousy game? Are you gonna make excuses for him? I was pretty tough. I was very tough on the teams that I covered. Ask any of the Dodgers during some of the seasons when they sucked about, how tough I was on them as a broadcaster. So I don't think I would have had that same edge had I been dating a player. So I chose not to do that. But if I was in another work environment, if I worked, in finance and, was in, a large firm or corporation where you meet a lot of people, then maybe that's different. I just think as a journalist, I had to separate myself and be one step away from having a personal relationship with anybody. And I wouldn't even go to go play golf or something with any of the players, or just not dating them, but just not socializing. I didn't go, I just thought that was a bad line to cross for myself. Now I know a lot of women did it. And a lot of men also befriend the players that they cover, and they will become golfing buddies or whatever. But I think that makes you a soft reporter, because you're not going to report fairly or honestly about that team or that person. You
got to be the enemy, kind of, right?
Not the enemy, but you have to be, you have to be somebody that reports fairly. And, if people talk about fake news, the press is the enemy. We're not. We're people that are trying to report on things that can help you in your community. But in terms of sports, that always makes me laugh, because it's sportscasters that are crossing that line and that are building these relationships and aren't necessarily reporting fairly on their teams. They're more like cheerleaders than they are reporters in some cases.
Yeah. Nate, do you have a question for Lisa? We only got a few minutes left with her.
Yeah, Lisa, as an NFL cheerleader, what did you, or I guess, the cheerleader do off season? Do you have another job, or do you do different sports cheerleading? What do y'all do?
I think his internet cut out if you heard him. I don't know if you heard the question.
A little bit, yeah. So he's asking what NFL cheerleaders do in the off season.
Yeah.
So, when I was an NFL cheerleader a long time ago in the 80s, we were expected to either be going to college at the same time or to have another job. Cheerleading was just a hobby. It's not a full-time job. And I think that's still the same today. Cheerleading to me is something that is fun, builds camaraderie with other women. I got a lot out of it because those women that I cheered with in the 80s are still my best friends today. So, I think here's where the problem lies for me with professional cheerleading. You are working for a $1 billion team, a multi-billion dollar, organization. It's now global. And these cheerleaders, in my case, I got paid $25 a game and got 2 free tickets up in the cheap seats from my dad. So I didn't think that was fair, that here are ambassadors, brand ambassadors for your team out in the community, doing charity work, wearing your uniform colors, representing you on calendars, on posters, and, performing during game day. and then getting paid $25, which doesn't even cover your gas for the week going to all these events and rehearsals. So I know the cheerleaders do a little bit better now, but it's not nearly what they should be getting paid, considering the time, the effort, and the fact that they're helping to build positivity in the community through being a brand ambassador. I think cheerleaders should get paid a lot more. But yeah, no, it's not a full-time job at all. We still have other jobs or are going to school in the in the off season.
It's funny, you have the backup or the third string quarterback that no one knows that's getting paid millions of dollars to ride the pine, but yet people get excited to watch the cheerleaders on the sideline or do halftime, and they're fans, and you'll have fans, but nobody knows who the second or third string quarterback is, but he's getting paid crazy amounts of money. It's nuts.
Yeah, even the mascots get paid more than the cheerleaders. Yeah. So come on, pay up.
Nikki, question for Lisa.
So right now, Nate is actually in Phoenix where the Super Bowl is being held, and being that you're into sports, I want to know who you're rooting for the Super Bowl.
I'm rooting for the Kansas City Chiefs, and I'll tell you why. Patrick Mahomes is a family friend. My ex-husband, who I'm still great friends with, Scott Erickson, used to play with his dad, Pat Mahomes. They played on the Twins together, and they won a World Series together. So Pat is an old family friend. And I remember Patrick when he was a wee little kid. And I remember Pat bringing Patrick into a locker room environment when Scott was playing. And after the game, I saw Patrick, who was maybe about 11 at the time. And his dad goes, he has a crush on you, but he's scared to ask you for a hug. So I went over and I tackled the little guy. So anyway, I feel very fondly about Pat and Patrick Mahomes. So I'm going to be rooting for the Kansas City Chiefs.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Everybody's got to pick a side for the Super Bowl, because the Super Bowl is bigger than just the football fan. And you have to have a reason why. You have to have a story. And, let's finish with this last question, because you'd be the perfect one to ask. I actually was just talking about it a couple episodes ago. I've been screaming this for years. In sports, and I'm a sports fan, in sports, you need more than just the game now more than ever. You need a storyline, you need an angle, you need a spin, right? You can't just have the sport.
There is too much competition for the viewer. There's too much competition for the typical person who's watching Netflix, who's got their job, who's got their kids, who watches sports as a hobby, not somebody in the sports industry. So for just the normal, typical people, there's a lot coming at them. And of course, there's their phone and social media. So in covering sports, there almost needs to be a hero and a villain. Mm-hmm. There needs to be interesting storylines. There have to be reasons to watch. What is your rooting interest? Why do you care? Give me a reason to care about a team, a player, a city. So these themes, these elements of interest are ways to drive the viewer to watch the game, because there is so much else to pull their interest and focus. Now, those of us that are huge sports fans, I'm going to watch any game, anytime. If it's on, I'll watch it. But for most people that have a life, unlike me, I guess, they want to know why am I going to spend 3 hours watching this game? I want to hear some serious dramatic backstory to help me really invest my time in this event.
Yeah. I always use the analogy of Star Wars. Luke Skywalker is nothing without Darth Vader. You need good versus evil. I'm a big fan of tennis, and I host the Atlanta Open, and I always try to, with my style, if you got a guy that's from Georgia, where we're doing the show at, or if you have the American versus the Russian, and kind of want to put them, you want to put them over a little bit, but they're still even keel, and there's no entertainment in the tennis world. Golf is very much the same way. Football's a little bit different. Baseball, different, because, you'll have the closer come out with the music. It's entertainment. You've got something, I like him because he comes out to Metallica, or I like him because he comes out to Guns N' Roses, whatever. Your story that you just shared about Patrick Mahomes, there are people that are listening to this that had no dog in the fight, will root for the Kansas City Chiefs just because that was such a great and cute story. So
It's about, these are human beings playing sports and we want to know why we care. Like, why should I care?
Right.
It's because this human being has an amazing backstory.
Yeah, I agree.
So I love sports.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and giving us all this time. Lisa Guerrero's memoir again is titled Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. You can pick that up wherever, Amazon or where you get books. And Lisa, you're a remarkable person. Keep doing what you're doing on Inside Edition. Thank you so much.
Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate you having me on, Jason. This was fun.
Bye-bye, Lisa. Thank you.
Bye.